This investigation is sponsored by Keeps. In 1634, a shoemaker living in Odense, Denmark, was dragged into the royal courtroom, wrapped in chains blessed by a local priest. The charges against him were grave. In his house, they found a pact which he made, written in ink mixed with his own blood. It read, quote, "I give myself to Satan to be his own with body and soul. Just as Dr. Faust became Satan's own, may I do the same." End quote. In his pact, the shoemaker referenced Dr. Johann Georg Faust, a historical figure from the 15th century, a German alchemist who supposedly sold his soul in exchange for all the hidden knowledge of the world. The fate of Dr. Faust was grim, however. Reports state that a laboratory explosion incinerated him alive. Was this a freak accident, or had the devil come to complete his end of the deal? Today, such a deal is known as a Faustian bargain. After Faust's death, a number of black magic Faustian grimoires began to appear across Europe, providing instructions on how to make this pact. For groups of ruffians who called themselves magical treasure hunters, these manuscripts were a favorite. One such was the German Helensfang manuscript, which translates to Infernal Compulsion. In 1715, a party of 3 German treasure hunters would use the Helensfang to summon demons to help them unearth buried treasure, and this incident became known as the Jena Christmas Eve tragedy. In the frosty, pitch-black night of Christmas Eve, they set out to make their fortune, and by morning, 2 were found dead with red marks across their body. The single survivor was banished from the country and would never be allowed to return. Hey fellow seekers, welcome. I'm Mr. Mythos. If you're a fan of strange and ancient mysteries with research so deep you're guaranteed to fall down the rabbit hole, you're in the right place. I humbly ask that you give this video a like and ding the notifications bell so you don't miss any of the rare info we'll be digging into every video. But before we dive into the perilous world of magical treasure hunting, these old grimoires claim a whole host of powers, but thankfully you don't need to consult with one to keep your hair. My hair is a treasure to me, and today's sponsor, Keeps, has helped me maintain and grow all this healthy hair, despite the fact that hair loss runs in my family. I've recommended them before on this channel, and I'll recommend them again. The best part is, I never had to go to my doctor's office or even leave my house to start this clinically proven treatment. They delivered straight to my door, and it cost half as much as it would have at my pharmacy. And they even offer 24/7 support from medical advisors and care specialists if you have any questions. Each treatment plan comes with unlimited messaging with your prescribing doctor. You also get refill reminders so you never run low. I have to say, they really make it easy. Hair loss stops with Keeps, and fans of my channel get a massive discount. For 50% off your first order, go to keeps.com/MrMythos or click my link in the description. That's keeps.com/MrMythos. Thanks again to Keeps. Let's hop right into the old practice of treasure hunting with magic, demons, and dangers galore. What exactly occurred on Christmas Eve, 1715, is confusing and was fiercely debated for over a century after the events. Earlier on in the year, in the city of Jena, Germany, 4 men had gotten together with a plan. Having lived in Jena for some years, all had long heard the legends that an ancient Germanic treasure trove lay buried somewhere in the town. Not much tied them together, with the exception that all wanted their share of this precious hoard. The organizer of the party was a man named Georg Heischle, a respected tailor and the owner of a major local vineyard. Heischle had peered out at his vineyard over the last several months, on new moons when the night was pitch black, and had witnessed an ethereal figure, a glowing woman in a flowing white dress who walked back and forth across certain parts of the land before disappearing. In old Germanic folklore, light-radiating maidens dressed in white were believed to be treasure spirits and guides. So in Heischle's eyes, her message was obvious. She was showing him that Jena's fabled treasure lied beneath his very own land. Heischle knew the terrible dangers of magical treasure hunting, however, and he himself was not about to take that risk. He also knew of the ominous requirement that this work must always be performed in a party. So, Over the months, Heisler sought out a fearless few in the town who might benefit as greatly as he. First, he recruited his friend Hans Friedrich Gessner, a shepherd from Dobritschen. Next to join them was a poor farmer from Ammerbach named Hans Zenner. The final member was a young local medical student, Johann Goddard Weber. Weber was crucial to the eventual path they would follow, as he was also a student of the occult, and happened to possess an authentic manuscript of the Faustian grimoire Helensfang. It was obvious that this book contained truly dark power, having been secured by the original bookbinder with 2 heavy locks made of lead, each engraved with magical symbols of protection. At 9 o'clock on Christmas Eve, the treasure hunters arrived at Heisler's door and he gave them the go-ahead to do the deed. Heisler himself would remain safely in his home, locking all his doors and windows. The 3 then wandered to the area in the vineyard where he had seen the glowing woman in white. It was snowing and cold out, but next to the location was a small cottage house where they could keep warm as they performed the ritual. On the cottage's front door, the medical student Johann Weber drew the Tetragrammaton, the name of God, in white lead for protection. He then unsheathed a blessed ritual sword and carved a magic circle on the ceiling, during which all 3 men repeated the Our Father prayer. Finally, they found some charcoal in the cottage and lit it in an empty flower pot to stave off the ice-cold temperatures. With this, it was finally time to go magical treasure hunting. The medical student pulled 2 rusted keys from his pocket and unlocked the Helensfang. The farmer and shepherd huddled around him as Weber flipped to the section titled "To Summon the Treasure-Keeping Spirits and Raise Them with Their Help." They then made the Faustian Pact and enacted the magic. The grimoire instructions stated that this invocation was supposed to be repeated 3 times, however, Weber only remembered being able to say it once. After this, he felt hypnotized and blacked out. The next morning, having never heard back from his treasure hunters, Georg Heisler walked over to the cottage house and opened the door. Weber was laying on a bench, unconscious, and disturbingly, he was covered head to toe in dark red marks. The other 2 men also had these same marks, but unlike Weber, they weren't breathing. Their bodies were cold and they had been dead for some time. Heisler had no choice but to turn himself in for the crime of magical treasure hunting. Late that evening, the authorities arrived and carted Weber off to an inn where he finally woke up, speaking hysterically. Heisler was taken to the town jail, and as night came, 3 guards were ordered to stay in the cottage with the 2 dead bodies. But this would prove to be a fatal mistake. The following morning, 2 of the 3 guards were dead, and all 3 bore the same dark red marks. The guard who survived, though, was lucid enough to report what had happened. He claimed that a malevolent ghost had manifested in front of them in the form of a small boy, then darted around them, shaking the entire cottage, and slammed the only door shut, after which they could not escape. These details and events were all recorded in the local Jena Chronicle in January 1716, after which word quickly spread across the country. The Jena doctor Erdmann Andrea examined the bodies but was unable to determine a cause of death. He thought that the red marks might indicate the involvement of some demonic entity. And in the official investigation, upon confessing the grimoire that was used, the final pieces of what happened were put together. They had been treasure hunting with the aid of demons, and thus these men repeated the same mistake as Dr. Faust. Both the vineyard owner Heisler and the student Weber would be banished from the country, Heisler for 10 years and Weber permanently. Remembrance of the Jena Christmas Eve tragedy would remain in the local tradition for over 200 years. Though the deaths of these magical treasure hunters were terrible and grim, don't let that wet the candle in this profession because, as with most extremely high-reward jobs, there's usually a similar amount of risk involved, and hard choices to be made. No one ever said magical treasure hunting was easy, and it's certainly not for the faint of heart. It's also been a far more popular career choice than you might imagine. I've gone over grimoires before on my channel that alluded to the summoning of demons for their help in locating buried treasure, and I'll tell you right now that you'd be surprised just how many surviving occult manuscripts contain magical rituals specifically for finding treasure. You'll easily find such magic in any goetic or necromantic grimoire. Historians believe this practice goes back at least 1 to 2,000 years, and there are even major instances of magical treasure hunting in the modern era. For example, the founding of the Mormon religion by Joseph Smith, which we'll be investigating at the end. Historically, though, this is an ancient practice and was even used by the common folk. In most instances, a person might be looking for an everyday object that they lost, anything from a misplaced soup ladle to precious jewelry, and often they'd employ the same magic used by professional treasure hunters. Yes, as the British historian Dr. Johannes Dellinger states, quote, "It is well known that until the 19th century, treasure seeking was steeped in magic," end quote. Dellinger is the author of Magical Treasure Hunting in Europe and North America, which I have a link to in the description if you're interested, and yeah, it's quite expensive, but it's the world's most comprehensive resource on this subject. It might be worth noting that Dellinger is also the descendant of a family of suspected witches who were tried back during the classical witch hunting period of Europe. So yeah, he's been one of my main resources here. The reasons why people turn to magically invoking spirits to help them find things, though, is obvious. Angels, demons, fairies, and elementals have long been associated with hidden knowledge and the ability to reveal the unknown. This, of course, includes the location of buried treasure. That which might lie beyond our own limitations of sight, the spirit realm can see it all relatively easily. After all, they exist outside the physical barriers of this world. But before we get any more magical, what's up with buried treasure? Well, it might be worth taking a second to explain this phenomenon of human history. And it wasn't just pirates, despite the amusing and somewhat accurate stereotype. Burying one's treasure was actually a common and surprisingly reasonable choice, back before the days of stable banking systems. In fact, we've been burying valuables since the Stone Age. But in recorded history, major efforts to bury hoards of treasure go back at least several hundred years before the Roman Empire. However, the Romans were really the ones to get people talking. The famous 18th century English politician and judge William Blackstone wrote that, quote, "When the Romans and other inhabitants of their respective countries which composed their empire were driven out by the northern nations, they concealed their money underground, with a view of resorting to it again when the heat of the eruption should be over, and the invaders driven back to their deserts. But as this never happened, the treasures were never claimed, and on the death of the owners, the secret died along with them." End quote. So, buried treasure is far from a myth. In fact, the largest hoard of Roman gold thus far was found in 1992 in Suffolk, England, today known as the Hoxton Hoard. The Anglo-Saxons of the 9th century also buried their treasure as the Vikings invaded their land, and their massive troves have since been unearthed too, such as the Staffordshire Hoard, which was found in 2009. Seeing as how we're still actively digging up buried treasure today, this quest for hidden riches was absolutely practical hundreds of years ago, and those living across Europe, both antiquaries and common folk, were well aware. The rush for buried gold, jewels, and relics was truly intense, and tens of thousands took it on as a full-time profession. According to the 19th century book, The Magic of the Middle Ages, quote, "They were ruined and adventurous students, magicians who wandered about in the rural districts of most of the European states, representing themselves as treasure diggers. These adventurers were associated in a regular guild, and had, like other vagrant tradesmen, their lodgings and hospitals in the cities." End quote. So it's not an understatement to say that it became an entire industry. The kings and queens of these countries would all employ royal treasure hunters just as they did royal alchemists and astrologers. The most talented treasure hunters were in high demand and would be fiercely competed for between royalty, and this would sometimes lead to serious diplomatic problems. For example, back in the 16th century, Duke Friedrich I of Württemberg was accused several times of kidnapping the King of Poland's favorite alchemist and treasure-hunting magician, which was a massive scandal at the time. It turned out that the Duke had ordered the kidnapping because he had already invested so much money on failed state-sponsored treasure hunts that it single-handedly put his people into poverty. Even with the help of ethereal beings of incomprehensible power, the results were always a gamble. But the point is, it was big business, and pretty much all treasure hunters employed magic, regardless of their education and social standing. Ironically, the use of magic in these hunts was typically against the law, a law which was almost entirely ignored. It really only existed to appease the church, as the royalty knew well that magic was just the way it was done, because it truly seemed to work. Those who took on the perilous career path of a magical treasure hunter often shared little in common beyond their end goal, from grave-digging thieves and fraudsters to alchemists and astrologers, to monks and politicians, and even the most educated scholars and wealthy merchants. They really came from all walks of life. Some worked under the crown and others criminally, treasure hunting without a valid permit. Yes, in most countries in Europe, an official permit was required to perform this act so that a share of the treasure would go to the royal family. The common laws treated unlicensed excavation as literally stealing from the king, and the sentence was usually death. To be a magical treasure hunter required courage and a thirst for fortune and glory. According to the expert Dr. Johannes Dellinger, most of them were men, and Catholic clergymen and monks were thought to be the most skilled treasure magicians. With very little exception, all magical treasure hunts were group ventures. Every party had an expert magician, of course, whose job was to use occult spells and rituals to communicate with spirits, locate the buried hoard, and pacify any evils that might be guarding it. The rest of the party were there to help with their unique skill sets, but mainly to keep their magician alive. They would brave remote forests and cave systems, traverse ruined necropolises, monasteries, and castles. They went wherever the local rumors took them. Ancient tumuli were prime candidates as well. Tumuli are massive burial mounds made of earth and stone, and mysteriously, they're found in great numbers across the world. Europe, Asia, Africa, and the Americas, all constructed during the late Stone Age to the early Bronze Age. Now overgrown with grass, tumuli distinctly resemble small hills, and the treasure hunters who excavated them are where the term hill diggers comes from. In general, any artificial feature of the landscape was an ideal starting point. An isolated group of trees, for example, but especially wayside crosses, which were stone and wooden crosses placed at an intersection of two paths, many of which served to warn pilgrims of dangerous places. If a treasure hunter's quest was successful, the payoff might be anything from a ragged sack of gold coins to a treasure chest of rare gems, and even relics that could change the fundamental understanding of a country's history and religion. But this was just the tip of the iceberg. It said that the most serious treasure magicians, an infamous group known as the Wandering Scholars, hunted strictly for objects of immense magical power. One such object was the famous lengthy grimoire, Ars Notoria, which legend tells was discovered almost 1,000 years ago by an unnamed Englishman who received permission from the King of Sicily, Roger II, to dig up the grave of Virgil, Rome's greatest poet. According to a retelling in the 1875 issue of the London Quarterly Review, quote, "This eccentric English traveler of vast literary and scientific attainments asked and obtained from King Roger of Sicily permission to possess himself of the bones of Virgil. Thinking him engaged in a wild goose chase, Roger offered no opposition, till the Englishman found in the center of the mountain the poet's sepulchre, with the body entire, and beneath the head, a book entitled Ars Notoria. He took away the volume, but the populace would not allow him to have the bones." End quote. There were other magical treasures that were searched for too, such as the Andwaranot, known as the ultimate treasure of the Norse sagas, which was a magical ring capable of producing gold. The Andwaranot was stolen from a dwarf by the god of mischief, Loki, and in revenge, the dwarf cursed it to bring destruction to whoever possessed it. Loki wasn't about to mess around with this curse though, so he quickly gave the ring to the king of the dwarves, Hreidmar. Hreidmar's son Fafnir then murdered him for the ring, after which Fafnir was violently transformed into a dragon to guard the Andwaranot. Of course, he would later be killed for it too. Perhaps the magical treasure hunters sought the Andwaranot not to use it, but to destroy it. As you might have guessed, this tale inspired The Lord of the Rings by J.R.R. Tolkien. For alchemists, their magical treasure of choice was the Powder of Projection, a more common name in those times for the Philosopher's Stone. The Powder of Projection was a substance believed to have the ability to transmute base metals such as lead into precious metals, particularly silver and gold. It was also thought to be the main ingredient in the Elixir of Life, a potion which would grant the drinker immortality. Alchemists throughout history were notoriously secretive, and since this substance was thought to be of such extreme potential, it was believed that those few alchemists who successfully created the Powder of Projection might have buried it in fear of the consequences of their discovery. And if you know a thing or two about alchemy, you'll agree that finding a buried vial of this substance by use of ritual magic would still be tremendously easier than creating it in a laboratory. That being said, nothing was ever easy here. Magical treasure hunting was always a difficult job. Even with the most skilled magicians and adventurers, a party's work was time-consuming and labor-intensive. Grimoire manuscripts needed to be translated with obscure instructions that had to be followed to the dot if one valued their life. There were also a number of expensive instruments that needed to be mastered. As for their toolset and equipment, besides a shovel, a treasure hunting license, and a spellbook, a treasure magician needed a special tool, known as a divining rod. As written in 1658 by the Italian scholar John Battista Porta in his book Natural Magic, quote, "They profess themselves able to find out treasures. They use 4 rods that are double-forked, the tops whereof sticking close together crossways. They hold the lower parts of them with their hands open. Near their belly, they seem to mumble verses, and the rods fall down. And where they fall, they bid those men to dig what would find treasures." End quote. As Porta suggests, a divining rod almost always resembled a large forked twig. In fact, the most effective divining rods were supposed to be an actual twig of around a year's worth of growth, ritualistically harvested from a tree at night. To use it, the divining rod is supposed to be held at the height of one's stomach, with the magician's 2 hands each grasping one of the forked arms, leaving the single long end sticking outward. It's also very important to not hold the rod's forks too tightly. An incantation, usually an invocation of a spirit, demon, or angel, must be said as the magician walks around their location of choice. While chanting, they hold the rod loosely and steadily, and when the divining rod dips down suddenly, that's an indication to get out the shovels and start digging, because that location is where the spirit is pointing. The origins of the divining rod are actually surprisingly old, as the earliest mentions of its use are found in the records of ancient Egypt. Its use spread heavily across Europe though, beginning with Rome, and eventually it even spawned a cousin, a closely related instrument known as a dowsing rod, which is used to find water, oil, minerals, and metal ores, as opposed to buried treasure. The divining rod, though, is more closely associated with the idea that a non-human entity is guiding the instrument. In some accounts, this entity may even be invoked to literally raise the treasure from out of the earth. But what kind of entities are we talking about here? Who are we magically treasure hunting with? Well, according to the wide array of instructional grimoires on this topic, the magician actually has options. There are a multitude of entity types a treasure magician can summon and recruit for their quest, but for today, we'll focus on the two that seem to have been the most popular, and those are demons and angels. While the choice between them may seem obvious, I'll tell you, it's not an easy decision. We'll begin with the most commonly summoned treasure-finding spirit, and one where the magician is really flirting with disaster. While these spirits are arguably the most reliable, they're also made of pure evil. I'm speaking, of course, of demons. Treasure hunting with demons comes in all shapes and forms. Similar to the operation of earth spirits, the demon might simply remain invisible and in the spiritual realm, guiding the divining rod in the party to where the treasure hoard is buried. It may whisper helpful advice in the ears of the members and provide spiritual protection from dangers, especially that of treasure-guarding spirits. On the other hand, many grimoires record that these demons will physically manifest before your very eyes, usually horrible in appearance, but sometimes in a more pleasing form which the summoner must specifically request. In the case of physical manifestation, though, the demon must always be constrained to a special Solomonic summoning circle for the magician's own safety, which acts as an unbreakable prison. So, instead of guiding the party, it might reveal details of the treasure's location, or even bring the treasure right to the summoner. In no case should the demon be let out of the Solomonic circle, though, no matter what it says or suggests. There's a truly long history of employing demons in quests for buried treasure. In fact, it's such a common combination that you'll find these specific spells and rituals in almost every Goetic grimoire. Despite this, it was never an officially acceptable practice, and while treasure hunting with magic was a gray area of legal consequence, if one was found recruiting demons for the task, they were guaranteed to face the consequences. One treasure-obsessed astrologer and influential member of the early 15th century Polish court was Henry the Bohemian, and in the year 1429, Henry was in serious trouble. What horrified the Polish royal family was that this same man was present at the births of all three of King Władysław II's sons, and Henry had even casted their horoscopes. Now he was facing a serious and compelling accusation of years of necromancy, demon conjuration, and the equally serious crime of unlicensed treasure hunting. Apparently, Henry had been running a secret side business with certain officials of the Royal University, where he and these shrewd professors would spend weekends arranging magical treasure hunts and excavating ruins with the help of demons. Demons Henry the Bohemian had summoned himself, and was suspected to have struck deals with. Upon searching his home, the Polish authorities discovered an entire library of forbidden necromantic books, after which Henry made a full confession. He was found guilty on all charges. However, as I mentioned, he was an influential courtier, and political networks are a powerful thing. Henry the Bohemian was nearly executed, but royal support spared him his life, the rest of which he would spend wasting away in a windowless prison cell. Occult scholars suspect that Henry the Bohemian was actually the author of a grimoire written for the Polish royal family, known as the Prayer Book of King Władysław. This book is unique in the world of grimoires because it deals heavily in holy prayers for the purpose of magical treasure hunting. Instead of demons, it instructed the reader to ritually evoke angels and God for their help in the hunt, painting a completely opposite picture than what Henry was really doing in the background. While this tale from history paints a dark picture, employing a demon for this purpose may not always be as diabolical as it seems. We should note that it doesn't always require a Faustian pact to collaborate with a demon and go treasure hunting with them. However, if the ritual doesn't involve spiritually beating the demon into submission by invoking the name of God repeatedly, maybe calling upon the archangels too, then the magician really needs to take a step back and ask themselves, what exactly are they exchanging for this service? If you already watched my obsessively deep dive into demonology, you know that demons don't play nicely and are a real challenge to enslave. And if at any point you think you're getting a deal, you're actually getting tricked. The pious route is almost always the most complicated, grueling, and lengthy. Think 18 plus months with no mistakes, but compared to other methods, enslaving a treasure hunting demon with the might of God would be the safest bet. Obviously, I can't responsibly recommend any sort of demon summoning, or probably any of the entities we'll be discussing, so this is all theoretical. I'm Mr. Mythos and I have a reputation to uphold. But as for the pious route, I covered such a method in my recent video, the overly complex ritual to summon a guardian angel, which, despite the title, deals a lot in conquering and controlling demons and making use of their demonic powers. The grimoire I investigated was the Book of the Sacred Magic of Abrumlin the Mage. First, the magician must complete the initial 18-month ritual, which involves constant, intense prayer, absolute isolation from society, and giving up nearly every pleasure in life. This results in their guardian angel showing up, who proceeds to chastise them about all the mistakes they made in front of God, and gives them the secrets of the final phase, which the magician must write down quickly, as the angel won't repeat them. Moving on to this final phase though, the magician must face off against the 12 kings and dukes of hell, who, if conquered, will be forced to serve the magician forever, including going treasure hunting with them. Chapter 16 of the grimoire's final section has the magic spells we're looking for. Quote, to find and take possession of all kinds of treasures, provided that they be not at all magically guarded. End quote. That single exception is rather unfortunate, because magically guarded treasures are extremely dangerous, and usually the ones most worth digging up. We'll be covering the absolute terrors of treasure guardians at the end, by the way, so if you take the pious route, you may be limited, but you'll hopefully have God on your side. There are, of course, other options. There are black magic grimoires, such as Touch Me Not from the 18th century, whose title is literally a warning to the potential reader not to touch it. It's also notable for its incredibly vivid artwork of the horrifying demons the dark side magician will be summoning. Like most other grimoires, the author and artist of Touch Me Not is unknown. It was written in Austria in 1795 and was rediscovered in London in 1928, and that's really all we know. The grimoire contains spells and recipes for many purposes, such as creating a magic mirror that can reflect all things past, present, future, physical, ethereal, and perhaps even the hidden civilizations of Inner Earth. However, the main focus of Touch Me Not is definitely magical treasure hunting. This is a book of infernal spells that instruct the user on how to summon none other than the devil himself, although other archdemons are also an option. Then sign a blood pact with them and command these dark forces to seek treasure. Hereward Tilton, the occult scholar and editor of the 2019 translation, describes the goals and dangers of this book. Quote, with their aid, hidden treasures are wrested from guardian spirits, and the black magician's highest ambition, an infernal transfiguration and union with the devil, can be fulfilled. But for those dilettantes who fail to follow the procedures to the letter, or succumb to their fears at lonely, God-forsaken sites in the dead of night, the consequences are dire. End quote. I think I might revise my previous statement, because even the black magic route is a serious pain. Arguably, it might be worse than the pious but torturous 18 months of God-fearing ritual detailed in the previously mentioned Book of Abrumlin. If properly employed, the ritual magic in Touch Me Not is literally supposed to drive the magician to a mental break. So the process is as follows. First, there are a number of recipes to choose from. Formulas for the concoction of deliriant, psychedelic potions designed to, in its own words, poison the imagination, which the magician must drink in large quantities. The author of Touch Me Not warns the black magician, quote, depending on one's constitution, these potions can cause varying degrees of affliction, including paralysis, insanity, and frenzy. The entire art of this secret consists in the correct proportion of the ingredients combined. End quote. Experts have looked into these recipes, and yes, these are real psychoactive brews, much like the ayahuasca of South American shamans. In fact, in the history of literature, Touch Me Not is possibly the earliest European work to specifically mention use of plants containing DMT, the psychedelic component of ayahuasca. So, you know whoever wrote this manual knew what they were doing. Every individual potion is supposed to provide contact with a specific demon. But getting steamrolled by diabolic intoxicants is just the pregame here. After the effects kick in, the magician must proceed to the sigillary body painting phase, as it's called, in which they are supposed to remove their clothing and paint their entire body, head to toe, with intricate demonic sigils. Finally, the grimoire instructs the magician to flip through its pages and take in the horrible cursed images it contains, all of which are drawn in highly realistic detail, and most of which I have to censor here due to being incredibly explicit and downright disturbing. So, while naked, tripping, and dripping with body paint, the magician is supposed to stare at these artworks until they reach a point where they are genuinely traumatized by them and fearing for their life. That's what it takes to prepare oneself, and finally the real work can begin. If they're somehow able to keep on reading, the magician is allowed to proceed with the archdemon and devil summoning rituals, which I should say are no less convoluted. But a successful Faustian bargain will recruit these powerful entities for the hunt. Here, the grimoire contains a depiction of what the end result should look like. Remember, magical treasure hunting should never be done alone, so here we have one ruffian performing some necromantic magic beneath a dead fellow, and below them is the excavator, in the nude, digging away for buried treasure. To the left, we see the main magician smiling because this whole thing actually worked. And of course, the devil is also right there with them. Alternatively, another page depicts what happens if the black magician makes a mistake. Those screaming faces are surely warranted. Thankfully, the grimoire doesn't show the gruesome aftermath. And if you're wondering about the artworks I've been showing, yes, these are the originals, scanned from the 1795 manuscript, drawn using a quill with ink and painted with watercolor. If nothing else, Touch Me Not is truly an impressive work of art, if only it weren't pure evil. Regardless of our approach, whether pious or diabolic, I can say that after doing all this research, it still seems far more reliable to successfully locate buried treasure with a demon than it is with an angel. To be fair, some of you might think that any angel willing to talk to a treasure hunter, let alone help them on their quest, might very well be classified as a fallen angel or demon. And I've gotten a lot of comments to that tune in previous videos. For this investigation though, we'll simply go by their explicit descriptions. These men claim they were working with angels, and perhaps they were. Additionally, you'll recognize pretty strong differences in terms of how angels collaborate with treasure hunters. They're a lot less cooperative compared to demons and not very reliable. Because, unlike demons, angels don't work for mortals, they work for God. So, unless your treasure hunt is righteous or holy, you'll be hard-pressed to get results. Still, many have tried, and some with apparent success. One such instance even led to the founding of a new religion. But before we get to that one, let's take a look at some of the frustrations experienced by one of my favorite duos in history, the 16th century mathematician Dr. John Dee and his shadowy accomplice, the alchemist Edward Kelly. I already made an entire documentary on these two men and their adventures scrying and summoning angels for convoluted conversations in their ill-fated quest to uncover the secrets of Enochian, the mysterious and long-lost angelic language. But I never once touched on the fact that John Dee was also a well-known magical treasure hunter. Records show that he had a strong interest in buried treasure as far back as 1570, and as a close advisor to Queen Elizabeth I, he employed lawful and pious magic mainly to dig up lost manuscripts for the glory of what he called the British Empire, a term which he actually coined. Though John Dee was a trained occultist and magician, he preferred to employ a talented spirit medium, also known as a scryer, to peer into his trusty obsidian mirror, through which the scryer would see images and converse with spirits, much like a modern psychic in a crystal ball. Dee had used several scryers throughout his career, but one would change his fate forever. This was Edward Kelly, a rather shady figure and pretty much the opposite of the devout, educated, and gentlemanly John Dee. Edward Kelly had cropped ears, which signified he was a former criminal convicted of fraud. However, he was also an extremely smart and capable man who managed to impress Dee with his skills in alchemy and displayed a remarkable talent as a scryer, the likes of which Dee had never seen before. Both Dee and Kelly were complicated characters who left many mysteries which are still up for debate, but what's known is that the pair would spend nearly 7 intimate years together staring into Dee's obsidian mirror, through which they claimed to hold extensive conversations with powerful archangels who transmitted to them the Enochian language. As I mentioned though, John Dee was also a magical treasure hunter, and on several occasions, the pair undertook quests for buried treasures with the assistance of these very angels. Many of Dee's journals are now unfortunately lost, as they were accidentally used as fireplace kindling by an illiterate maid, so there may be room for debate on this next point. But as far as the surviving records go, not a single one of these quests was successful, and that all seemed to be thanks to rather unhelpful angels. For example, in 1584, John Dee and Edward Kelly had been on a part-time hunt for a rumored lost treasure buried somewhere in Bohemia, when Dee's alchemist friend, Obrocht Woski, contacted him, informing Dee that he was in serious financial peril. At this time, Dee himself was in debt to multiple people, but Woski had been struggling financially for years now, and this time, the consequences seemed dire. So Dee and Kelly frantically asked the angels to reveal the location of the Bohemian treasure for Woski's sake. The result, though, was a complete non-answer. The angels ended the conversation right there. Woski would spend the next several years smuggling himself from country to country to avoid royal debt collectors. Sadly, even his own guardian angel Ubenladek, who he conversed with in scrying sessions with Dee and Kelly, didn't seem to care enough to help him. Another instance of angelic apathy would frustrate John Dee personally. In a scrying session in April 1583, the Angel Ill instructed Dee to travel to the English village of Blockley, where apparently a great buried treasure lay hidden. The angel also promised him that he wouldn't have to dig it up himself, as they would employ ethereal spirits to do it for him, so long as he obtained a sample of dirt from the land where the treasure lay. The Angel Ill said to him, quote, "If thou hast a parcel or part of every place of the earth, in any small quantity, thou mayest work by the creatures whose power it is to work in such causes." End quote. He had to obtain this parcel of earth quickly, though. The angel warned Dee to hurry, as a local man also knew the location, perhaps through magic of his own, and this man was gathering a magical treasure hunting party as they spoke. However, John Dee was a remarkably lawful man, and at that time he didn't possess a valid license to unearth buried treasure. So Dee traveled to London to apply for his license and sent Edward Kelly to Blockley to obtain the parcel of earth. When Dee and Kelly finally reunited a couple weeks later, treasure hunting license and dirt sample in hand, Kelly asked the angel what to do with the dirt. The Angel Ill responded with an ambiguous answer, which ultimately was as of much value as the dirt itself. As far as the records go, the two men never found the treasure. Angels aren't the most reliable or friendly bunch, at least in the depressing treasure hunts of John Dee and Edward Kelly, but it would be a shame to overlook an instance of the complete opposite, not in Renaissance Europe, but in 19th century North America. And though the next story and the religion it spawned may be controversial to many, let's take a few moments to investigate the man who you might have never considered to be the most famous and arguably the most successful treasure hunter in history, Joseph Smith, the founder of Mormonism. It's totally unknown to most, but for many years, Joseph Smith was a treasure hunter who indeed practiced the magical traditions of those before him. In fact, he was simply following in his own father's footsteps, who was a treasure seeker himself. His father, Joseph Smith Sr., had struggled with several short, unsuccessful jobs as a teacher, shopkeeper, and farmer, until one day he discovered an interest and talent for locating buried treasure, and this quickly became his profession while living and raising his family in Palmyra, New York. As we know, this work is usually performed in groups, so likewise, Smith Sr.'s sons joined him in a multitude of hunts and excavations throughout the 1820s. According to the book, The Refiner's Fire, The Making of Mormon Cosmology, Smith Sr., in a conversation with his neighbor, described one of the treasure tricks he used. Quote, "The best time for digging money was in the heat of the summer, when the heat of the sun caused the chests of money to rise to the top of the ground." End quote. Though that may seem simple enough, it's likely that there was far more ritual magic involved than he let on. We can deduce this by considering the early treasure hunting methods of his son Joseph Smith Jr., the future prophet of Mormonism. Smith Jr. was an active treasure hunter for nearly 10 years. As for his technique, he practiced the magical rites and superstitions brought by the settlers of the New World. Among other things, these included the use of magical circles drawn around the dig site to protect against the treasure's guardian spirits, and the use of silver tools, such as a silver spade or spoon, used to dig up a small patch of the earth before diving in with a full shovel, and this was to ensure luck in the excavation. Finally, Smith also followed the New World tradition of blood offerings. The purpose of a blood offering was to pacify the treasure guardian spirit, following the belief that the guardian was actually the ghost of a person murdered at the spot and intentionally buried with the treasure to protect it, with their blood long ago soaked into the ground. According to the historian Alan Taylor, in his scholarly article, The Early Republic's Supernatural Economy, quote, "Smith sacrificed pure white or jet black sheep or dogs to lay out magic circles of blood." End quote. While this may seem grim and gruesome in modern day, Joseph Smith's use of blood offerings and other ritual magic wasn't unusual at all. These were all commonplace practices for New World treasure hunters. For example, the same article describes the American politician Thurlow Weed using a black cat for the same purpose, sadly. As for Smith's preferred tool for locating buried treasure, he did sometimes employ a divining rod, but his main instrument of choice was a peepstone, which is a stone with a hole hollowed through the center, which he would peer through in order to see things otherwise invisible to the naked eye. Joseph Smith had actually been fond of this particular tool since he was a schoolboy, foretelling future events and finding lost objects for his friends, who gave him the catchy nickname Peepstone Joe. An altered rendition of this peepstone tool would later be used by Smith to translate the Book of Mormon from the golden plates, a holy prophetic treasure that an angel helped him locate. Smith would later identify these particular peepstones with the Urim and Thummim, a magical technology spoken of in the Bible's Old Testament, and another weird mystery which I investigated previously. Returning to the angels, though, what was particularly unusual in his practice was the involvement of the divine messengers of God. It all began in 1823, and the following is an account of what Joseph Smith experienced that year. To set the scene, it was a clear moonlit September night outside of Smith's home in the forested western New York. The young man was outside alone, and the angel appeared to him suddenly in a white radiating brilliance. In Joseph Smith's own words, quote, "While I was thus in the act of calling upon God, I discovered a light appearing in the room, when immediately a personage appeared at my bedside, standing in the air, for his feet did not touch the floor. He had on a loose robe of the most exquisite whiteness. His hands were naked and his arms also. So were his feet naked, as were his legs. His head and neck were also bare. I could discover that he had no other clothing on but this robe. Not only was his robe exceedingly white, but his whole person was glorious beyond description, and his countenance truly like lightning. When I first looked upon him, I was afraid, but the fear soon left me. He called me by name and said unto me that he was a messenger sent from the presence of God to me, and that his name was Nephi, that God had a work for me to do. He said there was a book deposited, written upon gold plates, giving an account of the former inhabitants of this continent and the source from whence they sprang. He also said that the fullness of the everlasting gospel was contained in it, as delivered by the Savior to the ancient inhabitants. Also that there were 2 stones in silver bows, and these stones fastened to a breastplate constituted what is called the Urim and Thummim, deposited with the plates, and the possession and use of these stones was what constituted seers in ancient and former times, and that God had prepared them for the purpose of translating the book." End quote. After delivering this message, the angel then revealed the location. The golden plates were buried under a hill near his home in Manchester. The young seeker grabbed a shovel and, unlike the European magical treasure hunters who traveled in a party, Smith ventured on completely alone. Well, except for the divine entity next to him. When they arrived at the hill, the angel pointed to the location and he dug into the ground. Eventually his shovel clanked against a solid object. On his knees, Smith cleared the dirt and revealed an ancient stone box. However, the angel prevented him from removing the treasure inside, the golden plates. The angel then informed him that he had to wait 1 year and return to the spot exactly on the date, and only then could he take the plates. So, as instructed, exactly 1 year later, Smith returned, but was unable to take the plates. 1 year after, Smith tried again, but was still unable to take them. Yet another year passed and Smith made another attempt, but the plates were simply untakeable. However, with faith unshakable, he traveled to that hill one more time, right on time, and this time, the angel let him take the plates. Smith then used the Urim and Thummim peepstones to translate the golden plates, which were written in a script that the Book of Mormon refers to as the Reformed Egyptian language, thought by Mormons to date as far back as the 6th century BC. And the golden plates themselves were believed to be the origin of the Mormon sacred doctrine, the Book of Mormon, which contains, among other things, the forgotten history of the Nephites, an ancient Israelite people who migrated and settled in the Americas in 589 BC, according to the church. Today, Mormonism, the Latter-day Saint movement started by Smith and this treasure, has over 16 million followers and 282 temples across the world as of 2022. So, from what we've seen, the rewards of magical treasure hunting can truly be vast. And Joseph Smith's experience shows that angels perhaps can be powerful treasure finders, given the right individual and cause. But let's rewind time and travel all the way back to Renaissance Europe, where this profession was truly in its quintessential form, and where demons and angels were both recognized as capable collaborators. Decisions had to be made based on pros and cons, and In the end, the consequences were one's own. Assuming the magician has a full party and a holy or unholy entity on their side, the only thing left to do is to venture into the ancient ruins of the past and determine where the treasure might lay. The magician holds the divining rod with both hands, chanting as he walks, though the spirit is clearly guiding his movement. The rod drops down suddenly. X marks the spot. The rest of their party grab their shovels excitedly, but the magician turns around and puts his finger to his lips. As a treasure hunting professional, this expert knows that many grimoires warn that the digging must only be done in the strictest of silence. As written in Volume 2 of the Characteristics of Gotha, 1833, quote, "A very deep meaning lies in that notion that a man in search of buried treasure must work in utter silence, must not speak a word, whatever appearance, either terrific or delightful, may present itself." End quote. Striking treasure would, of course, be the delight, but there are certain terrors that a hunting party must be aware of, because in these empty ruins, they aren't alone. No matter what culture or era, it's a near universal thought that certain sites of great treasure hoards or magical relics will always be protected by powerful demons or malevolent guardian spirits, awakened by treasure hunters who can be sure of the consequences if they aren't properly pacified. The entities know what you've come to take, and they're bound to their duty to protect it. The Key of Solomon states, quote, "It often happeneth that those men who undertake a search for said treasures are tormented and sometimes put to death by the aforesaid spirits." End quote. The guardian entities aren't gentle with bringing death to treasure seekers, though. Rather, they are ruthlessly violent. Legends have been told far more gruesome than the Jena Christmas Eve tragedy. There are accounts of group insanity, ending in heads removed by each other's shovels. And if the guardian spirits decide to do the deed personally, you can expect the result to be exponentially more horrible. Though many guardian entities are rumored to be demons or ghosts, in Europe, most were thought to be elemental spirits and familiars associated with treasure. These ancient primordial entities would often assume certain physical forms. In older folklore, these were usually that of birds, snakes, and oxen, but many legends and reports also describe beasts such as massive black dogs, aka hellhounds, the ghosts of giants known as spriggans, and of course the famous fire-breathing dragon. Additionally, they may appear in forms meant to mirror your own worst nightmare, reading your soul and knowing exactly what you fear most. If the sight is rumored to be especially dangerous, or if the party feels a creeping heaviness around them, any magician worth their title must immediately employ an incantation of protection and the pacification of evil. Admittedly, there are many dangers to treasure hunting. One may be executed without a valid license. Loose stones on the floor can send a party falling to their death. Crumbling ceilings can crush them. All are better fates than to suffer the guardian of the treasure. They are the reason why magical treasure hunting is so treacherous. On a more optimistic note, though, magical treasure hunters actually have their own designated patron saint. In Catholicism and other Christian traditions, a patron saint is a heavenly protector, once a historical figure important to the church and the people, and now deceased. Their Holy Spirit is bound to protect a person, group, society, or place. In the case of magical treasure hunters, their patron saint is Saint Christopher, the giant warrior who is sometimes depicted as having the head of a dog. While scholars and theologians have never identified an obvious connection as to why St. Christopher is the patron saint of treasure hunters, considering he's usually depicted as a warrior of enormous size, it makes sense that magical treasure hunters would want the strongest holy guardian they could get. Before a party dug their shovels into the ground, an incantation known as the Christopher Prayer would be said. And it was intense. A German Christopher Prayer manuscript confiscated in 1741 was 43 pages long, its verses literally begging, pleading, and demanding St. Christopher for his protection. It would be foolish, though, to rely on St. Christopher alone. The party's expert magician should be equipped with spells to use on the fly, whatever the situation calls for, and whatever it takes to pacify the demon or malevolent spirit. By this point, they should have already taken several preliminary measures, too. Each member of the party may want to wear a talisman inscribed with the fifth pentacle of Saturn, as depicted in the grimoire The Greater Key of Solomon, which is specifically described to chase away spirits which guard treasures. A standard exorcism of the location may be another wise precaution to take, and in the case that the buried treasure was revealed with ease, and no dangers yet presented themselves, it would be smart to perform an exorcism on the treasure itself, because sometimes the guardian has been bound to the golden hoard, just waiting for greedy fingers to touch it, and a greedy body it will swiftly possess or curse to death. But thankfully, if you employed an ethereal entity in your hunt, they might be able to fight for you, depending on the pact you made and whether they are willing to. It's said that a battle between ethereal beings is fought in the ether, so the fight unfortunately can't be seen by the naked eye, but instead occurs as a sort of interdimensional blur. A good way to visualize this might be the Middle Eastern folk belief that a sandstorm is a battle between jinn, the pre-Islamic demons of the Arabic world. More than visual, of course, you'll feel its intense power. The danger now is whether your ethereal entity will win. If, finally, you, the magician, find yourself face to face with a guardian spirit capable of passing all the previously mentioned efforts, there may still be hope. In mythology, there are countless tales of the hero defeating the treasure guardian by cunning and clever trickery, but I prefer the folklore, as it's a bit more straightforward. Remember that if a treasure guardian has been bound to a treasure, there are always conditions to override its magical contract. Otherwise, what would be the point of burying treasure if it can't ever be retrieved? Therefore, every treasure guardian should have a secret to pacify it. Grimoires and magic are powerful stuff, but treasure hunters should always do their homework and have an idea of what it takes to break the curse. This is shown in an old Swedish folktale that had been passed through the centuries. Quote, "An extremely wealthy farmer put his money in a copper kettle and buried it beneath the floor of his barn. The burial ceremony was such that no one could take up the goods until 3 brothers had been beheaded on the spot, and flame and fire and plow and harrow had gone over the ashes. But the farmhand lay nearby, listening. And when the farmer had died, the farmhand went there and slaughtered 3 male pigs from the same litter. Then he made a fire and plowed and harrowed in the ashes. In this way, he was able to retrieve the entire treasure, and the dragon could do nothing about it." End quote. And such was the end to many magical treasure hunts whose legends spread across Europe, a history which dates back possibly 2,000 years. I don't mean to tease, but I collected way more magical treasure stories that have nothing to do with the Christianized demons and angels we focused on here, but instead other entities from folklore who can also join a party, like fairies, jinn, and even dragons. So, if I make a part 2, let me know which one you want me to investigate most down in the comments below. Thank you all for watching, and if you enjoyed this video and haven't seen my last one, the overly complex ritual to summon a guardian angel, that's the one to watch for more info on the grueling trials one must pass to access this kind of occult magic. Or, if you want something a bit different, I'd love to recommend The Life and Times of an Immortal Alchemist, where I go in deep on the 2 treasures of alchemy, the Elixir of Life and the Philosopher's Stone. Thank you to my patrons. I know a bunch of you joined recently, and I want to give you a huge welcome and let you know that I truly appreciate your support. You guys make these videos a reality, so if you'd like to join in too, I've got links in the description where you can make a one-time donation or pledge monthly if you wish, even as little as $2. It all goes to the production of future content, so thank you. I'm Mr. Mythos. You guys are awesome. I'll see you in the next one. Peace.